早晨，歡迎我哋嚟到教會或者喺網上一同參加崇拜嘅弟兄姊妹，讓我哋安靜預備心，一同嘅敬拜神。聖經話：來啊，我們要屈膝敬拜，喺做我哋嘅耶和華面前跪下，因為佢係我哋嘅神，我哋係佢草場嘅羊，係佢手下嘅民。惟願你們今天聽他的話。讓我哋一齊嘅向神係歌唱敬拜。
請會眾一同站立。 這是天父世界，詩歌述說天父世界嘅美麗，環顧樹木花草，鳥兒輕風都係唱頌天父世界嘅偉大，更睇到神同在嘅大能。有時候我哋或者遇到不公義，但係請你唔好忘記，主仍是王，佢仍在掌權。我哋要耐心等候，只要我哋抬頭看看天空，我哋口中自然會發出讚美嘅聲音，心中盼望神與我哋同在。這是天父世界。
這是天父世界，我要側耳傾聽，宇宙唱歌四位英王，聖神作樂同聲。 隨自從顯主奧妙，天父充滿世界。這是天父世界，靠主叫我不忘，追世兇狠好像得勝，天父卻應作王。這是天父世界，戰爭還沒有完，受死基督得勝滿足，天地歸主掌權。
腓立比書4章6至7節，應當一無掛慮，只要凡事藉着禱告、感謝，將你們所要的告訴神，神所賜出人意外的平安，必在基督耶穌裏保守你們的心懷意念。
請我哋同心嘅禱告。聖天父上帝，我哋讚美你，你創造咗天地萬物，百花嘅美麗，群鳥嘅歌唱，海中嘅魚，地上各類嘅活物，星辰運行嘅有序，係證明你創造嘅精細。你係王，你統治萬國萬方。我哋只不過係你手造嘅民，你係我哋嘅神，願意我哋今日聽你嘅話。我哋感謝父神嘅恩典，因聖靈嘅帶領，使到信徒係將福音從耶路撒冷傳到外邦，讓我哋係有機會得聞呢個好消息。明白愛子耶穌降世為人，被釘喺十字架上邊所流嘅血，能夠洗淨我哋嘅罪。我哋如果口裏承認耶穌為主，心裏信神叫佢從死裏復活，就可以得救。我哋唔單止得到呢個救恩，神亦都係賜俾我哋子女嘅名分，讓我哋珍惜並體貼父神嘅心意，喺世上存活嘅日子裏邊，能夠係連接於真嘅葡萄樹， 係為神多結屬靈嘅果子，係求神讓世人睇到自己嘅驕傲、無知同埋限制，因為我哋同係神所做嘅，讓我哋能夠係多啲接納同埋包容別人。喺世界各地嘅天災未受控嘅疫情同埋地緣嘅政局，主啊，求你係憐憫，讓世上在位執政嘅能夠多認識呢位創造嘅宇宙嘅真神，能夠順服神嘅帶領，能夠愛護佢嘅人民，喺施政上邊係顧及各階層嘅需要。喺神所定嘅日子，就讓世界能夠係恢復常態，人民嘅生活能夠得到安穩。亦都係求聖靈保惠師嘅同在，讓我哋今日喺聽神嘅話語嘅時候，能夠我哋係得到造就。以上嘅禱告係奉主耶穌基督得勝嘅名字祈求。今日講到嘅經文係出自出埃及記1章1至22節，請聽我讀出。以色列的眾子各帶家眷和雅各一同來到埃及，他們的名字記在下面：有流便、西面、利未、猶大、以撒迦、西布倫、便雅憫、但、拿弗他利、迦得、亞設。凡從雅各而生的共有70人。約瑟已經在埃及。約瑟和他的弟兄並那一代的人都死了。以色列人生養眾多，並且繁茂，極其強盛，滿了那地。有不認識約瑟的新王起來治理埃及，對他的百姓說：看啊，這以色列人比我們還多，又比我們強盛。來吧，我們不如用巧計待他們，恐怕他們多起來。日後若遇什麼爭戰的事，就聯合我們的仇敵攻擊我們，離開這地去了。於是埃及人派督工的轄制他們，加重擔苦待他們。他們為法老建造2座積貨城，就是比東和蘭實。只是越發苦害他們，他們越發多起來，越發蔓延。埃及人就因以色列人受煩。埃及人嚴嚴地使以色列人做工，使他們因做苦工覺得命苦。無論是和泥，是做磚，是做田間各樣的工，在一切的工上都嚴嚴地待他們。第15節，有希伯來的2個收生婆，一名斯弗拉，一名普亞。埃及王對他們說：你們為希伯來婦人收生，看他們臨盆的時候，若是男孩，就把他殺了；若是女孩，就留他存活。但是收生婆敬畏神，不照埃及王的吩咐行，竟存留男孩的性命。埃及王召了收生婆來說：你們為什麼做這事，存留男孩的性命呢？收生婆對法老說：因為希伯來婦人與埃及婦人不同。希伯來婦人本是健壯的，收生婆還沒有到，他們已經生產了。神厚待收生婆，以色列人多起來，極其強盛。收生婆因為敬畏神，神便叫他們成立家室。法老吩咐他的眾民說：以色列人所生的男孩，你們都要丟在河裏；一切的女孩，你們要存留他的性命。今日係為我哋證道嘅係本堂嘅主任牧師 John Merchant。
Good morning, everyone. I wish I was with you in person, but as you listen today, I'm actually in Japan visiting my son and daughter-in-law and meeting my grandson for the first time. I'm recording this a month in advance, so hopefully the world is still in place. Today, we start a series from the book of Exodus called Possessing Our Destiny. I'd really encourage you to go to our website where you can find a short introduction to the book, which will help you see why we pastors want all of us to learn from it. We'd originally organised and started this series a year ago, But after only 1 week, COVID lockdown came and we had to change plans. Yet, if anything, now is probably even a more relevant time to be doing it. This story of people longing for something better and how God leads, forms, and moves with them is something all of us can relate to directly. He has promised us a destiny to possess too. So as we start together, let me first pray. Our good God, we are people who long for life as you intend it to be. We want to know you and be shaped by you to experience you with us and share in your glory. So please open our minds, touch our souls, and direct our bodies that we might live as your people in this time. Come to us through your word in grace and power. Help us to be humble and attentive, bold and encouraging. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Have you ever done a timeline in your life? It's where you write down or draw symbols of the key experiences over your lifespan. It includes things like moving house or country, the birth of a sibling or death of a close family member, education and work changes, romantic relationships you start or stop, even key conversations or books you read. You can also put down your feelings connected to those events, times of positivity and having a lifted mood, or times of disturbance and struggle. When you've done it, not only can you read the story of your life, but it becomes a powerful means of reflecting upon who you are and who you've become because of these key experiences. It gives us self-understanding. In the additional materials on our website, I've included this exercise for you, and I really encourage you to take the time to do it. I have done these timelines several times in my life, and it's helped me see the circumstances of my social environment around me and even the small events that have really changed the course of my life. For example, when I was a teenager, my family went on a picnic with another family we were close to when I was younger, but we hadn't seen them in some time. It was on that picnic that the boy of that family invited me to come with him to church, which I did. And this was the beginning of my Christian experience. And I wonder if I'd never gone on that picnic, whether I would have ever become a Christian. More negatively, I can see how some of my own attitudes and my present relationship with my mother is shaped by our past, including things which happened before I was born. My great-grandfather was an officer in the British Army in India. He was decorated for service by Queen Victoria herself, my family proudly tells me. But he lived in an environment where he had a very superior attitude to those he lived amongst. When they migrated to Australia, they brought those attitudes with them. They thought they were above everybody. They had high expectations of life and everybody else was below them. My mother was raised in that family by my grandmother with that same attitude. I see with some frustration that this is still in my mum, and it causes tension between us. What my mum didn't know until recently was that her mother and the man who became her father got together before they were married and had a child, which was a great shame in their family. My mum was born out of wedlock, or was going to be, but my grandfather, being the man he was, forged the birth certificate. So she grew up believing she was a year younger than what she really was. She thought she was just tall for her age. But this meant that my grandfather was never welcomed in the family. He was beneath their social class. He was a man who could not be trusted because of what he'd done to their darling daughter. And that also shaped the attitude towards my father, who also did not meet their expectations. Most importantly in all of this, I can see these attitudes and how they shaped my upbringing and were instilled in me. I don't want to be a person like that. And so wrestling with these things deep within myself is my ongoing challenge and struggle. I would much rather be a humble person. Every person is complex. We are all a mix of good and bad things. But often we don't realise where these things come from or why we behave as we do, because we have been shaped by our experience without us realising at the time. All of us have complex life stories. The question is, who tells it? Whose voice is listened to? Whose voice is ignored or silenced? Who decides who gets mentioned and who gets left out? What things are retold as important and which are minimalised or forgotten from the timeline? Just before COVID, I went to see the musical Hamilton. I must confess, I'm not a big fan of musicals, but I love this one. It's all about recovering the story of Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, largely forgotten in telling the story of the making of the American nation. The orphan boy Hamilton rises from poverty by the sheer power of his genius and his ability with words. He is driven to achieve and leave a legacy, to do something with his life. He didn't want to waste his life, or the refrain that goes through the songs in the show is, he didn't want to waste his shot at life. And indeed, for many years, the shot he was remembered for is the bullet that killed him, fired in a duel with another founding father, Vice President Aaron Burr. As George Washington advises him in the song, "History has its eyes on you," you have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story. But of course, the far more significant voices which have been unheard for so long in American history are those of the indigenous Native Americans and the African slaves, upon whose land and labour the country was built and these men became rich. The great intentional silencing runs deeply all the way through US history, and it continues to shape their present life as a nation. There's a great contradiction which causes tension in American life. It's there from the very beginning, and it's shaped everyone who has lived in the United States. You can see it in one of their great founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, a man famous for drafting the Declaration of Independence, which was written very intentionally to be the authoritative understanding of who the USA, as they became independent from Great Britain, was to be. It says in the preamble, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Yet Jefferson, who wrote these words, owned more than 600 slaves who worked his estate at Monticello. This included Sally Hemings, a slave girl who bore him at least 6 children, with whom he started a sexual relationship, which his wife knew all about, when he was in his mid-40s and she was only 13 or 14. We should wonder what choices Sally had in this arrangement. How could this same man justify that behaviour of treating people so much as less than himself, that they're just proper to be used for his own gain, and yet write those amazing words? This is part of the history of the USA that they are still struggling to come to terms with. These old events shape today, where people of colour still have to speak up and say Black Lives Matter. These experiences and those like them also shape the fabric of daily life in the history of the people of Israel. For they also have a history of slavery, oppression, and abuse. This was important for them to see that in their own timeline, their own telling of it, it was part of their life story because of what it would do for them. The book of Exodus is in many ways a timeline, a history of their life. It's for them to read from one generation to the next over and over so that their story is properly understood. It gives Israel's self-understanding from the key events which happened to them that made them who they are, and especially of the God who had made himself known and shaped their story as they related with him through all of it. Their story also includes slavery and exploitation, horrific genocidal human behaviour motivated by insecurity and greed. It was written so that we can also hear the silenced voices. Now, when was it written, and why did they need to know that history? The final version of the story, the telling which has come down to us as scripture, took its final form almost a millennia after these events happened. It was compiled by putting together things which Moses and others wrote, ancient songs that they still sang, and stories passed down in careful oral tradition. It was a theological telling, not a newspaper article dealing with events as we might report them. It gives us an interpretation of those things. So we mustn't get too literal or hung up on the details. It's the meaning which is important for the writer. Knowing who they are and understanding from their past will provide for them direction in the present. It will shape the choices that they will make now. For Exodus was written in a time of life for Israel when they were again under the oppression of a foreign nation, a hostile ruler. They were in exile in Babylon. Their nation had been destroyed and everything was in turmoil. They need to know again, who are we? What is our identity? Where is God? What will be our legacy? Will we simply disappear from history? Has everything been for nothing? Or does God still have a purpose for all of us in all of this? Do we have a future? So the writer goes back to their origins, telling the story of who they are, of a previous time of oppression and abuse, because that will direct them to be who they need to be in the present. They are longing for something better and hoping to possess their long imagined destiny, which seems to have all come to nothing. Many of us are longing for something better. We wonder, where is our life going? What will be the tale that is told, and who will tell it when our life is finished? We are studying this book because it's part of our history too, as we have joined in this story, as we'll understand as we get deeper into it. Today, I just want to introduce this series, giving us some understanding of the story just to get our bearings. Having read some historical works about the founding fathers of America gave me a deeper appreciation for the details in Hamilton as I heard them. It's the same with reading the book of Exodus. Having an idea of the bigger picture helps us appreciate the details, and knowing where things fit helps us feel their significance. I don't want to do that in detail today because this is a sermon, it's not a lecture. Instead, you'll get some materials in the resources which are on our website. You'll get much more out of the preaching in the next few months if you look at that stuff. So let's get to this first chapter in the book of Exodus. It opens with a people oppressed and in despair. They are powerless, hopeless, and afraid. They are exploited for another's greed and comfort. We want to put our minds into the feelings of those people as we read their story. We are going to hear the voices of those who are usually silenced. We read how God heard the cries of these marginalised slaves and how he acted. The writer starts telling this story in a really strange way. We don't pick this up, I think, in either the English or Chinese translations of our Bible. The Hebrew Bible of Exodus starts with the word and. And isn't a good way of starting a sentence, much less a story. What's going on? If you look at the books of Leviticus and Numbers, they also start with the word and. Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are all telling one story. And so we need to understand what's happening in Exodus of light of what's already happened in Genesis. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 starts, and these are the names. Then he lists them in verses 2 to 5. These names are important people in their history, and they want to remember them so that they might know and be telling who they are and where they've come from. Our word Exodus is from a Greek word that's transliterated from Exodus chapter 19, verse 1. It means departure or way out of a situation. So using the word Exodus is saying this is a story of people who moved out of something bad into something good and new. Jewish people call this book not Exodus, but names, because they especially want to think of who it was that moved, remembering the names of their ancestors and knowing that this is how God deals with these people. He deals with us, as we see in history, because he's made these promises to us. And this is what it means to belong to him, because it's our story too. Genesis, the book before Exodus, ends in chapter 50 with all the family of Israel living in Egypt because God had sent them there to survive a famine. Joseph tells his brothers, the fathers of the nation, that he's about to die, but that God will come and bring them up out of the land of Egypt and take them into their own land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their ancestors. Exodus tells the story of how God finally fulfilled that promise. God had caused them to prosper in Egypt. That family of 70 people had grown into a nation of many thousands. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7 tells us, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." Literally, they swarm, filling the land. It's the same word that will be used later about the plague of frogs swarming everywhere. This reflects the promise of blessing back in Genesis, where God blessed people by saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." God said that in creation back in Genesis 1:28 to Adam. He'd said it to Noah after the flood, the new start to life back in Genesis chapter 9 verse 1. And then he said it again to Abraham in Genesis 13:16 and 15:5. God says to Abraham, "You're going to have so many descendants, it'll be like counting the dust of the earth or the stars of the sky." God will bless them and make them a blessing to all people, so that whoever blesses them will be blessed, and whoever curses them will be cursed. For God is accomplishing his good purposes for all creation through this chosen people. We see how that blessing was interpreted as a problem for the people of Egypt. Exodus 1 and verse 8. "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." When it says that he didn't know him, it doesn't mean he's ignorant of Joseph, but rather that he had no regard for him or felt any obligation towards him or his descendants. Of course he knew who Joseph was and who these foreigners were, but he didn't like them, which is what prompts his oppressive actions. In verse 9 and 10, we see what Pharaoh does. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Pharaoh feels threatened by the foreigner, the one who's different and doing well. Haven't we heard similar stories here in Australia? Not so many years ago, some people were saying we are being swamped by Asians. They invented the accusation was that, well, they're taking all our jobs. Then it became all about the Muslims. They'll bring their culture and customs and we'll lose our way of life. They'll try and take over or support our enemies because they're spies and secret terrorists. These sort of populist voices raise all of these ideas to play upon people's prejudice and fear of difference. Blame the refugee, blame the person in need, blame the person who does well by working hard when you are not doing so well. I think perhaps some of you have experienced this directly. This is exactly what Pharaoh does. It's an old strategy that seems to work well. Everything is based on what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? He says. He breeds suspicion and distrust and turns one segment of the population on the other. From verse 11 onwards, we read how he instigates systematic oppression. Again, we see this in many countries around the world, where one group of people is treated differently from another. But we've also already seen that in a strange way back in Genesis. And Exodus, I think, wants us to link these stories. It's interesting in verse 11 where the writer speaks of the oppression the Israelites experienced. The same word is used in a weird story in Genesis that might help us understand what is happening and why these events take place. Do you know the story of Hagar in Genesis? Abraham married Sarah and they couldn't have children. Sarah had a slave, an Egyptian slave called Hagar. Sarah said, "Abraham, well, you go and have her. We can't have children. You use her." And so he does, and she has a child called Ishmael. But then Sarah gets incredibly jealous, despising and mistreating Hagar. That's a weak way of saying it, because the Hebrew word actually that describes Sarah's treatment says that she treats her oppressively, the very same word used in Exodus of the oppression of Pharaoh. Abraham then kicks Hagar and Ishmael out, and they walk into the wilderness and are about to die. God hears their cry and brings them water to sustain them. All these things will be played out again in the Exodus story for Israel. Bringing these two stories together, the writer is helping us to reflect upon the character of God and how Israel is to behave because of what they have learnt. Moses will say over and over in the book of Deuteronomy that God loves the foreigner in your midst, and you as his people must therefore care for, feed and clothe the foreigner, because this is what God is always like in his love and care for all people. This is what you and we should learn from slavery in Egypt. Life is complex, isn't it? And I love it how the Bible is like this. It doesn't make goodies and baddies where people are only one thing. Here in this story, the great patriarch Abraham is behaving poorly. The mother of the nation, Sarah, is not so nice. They are just like Thomas Jefferson. And so are all of us. People are complex. We are complex. This is what the writer wants us to think about. How do I see this in my own life? What from our life story is shaping how we behave? And what should we learn and grow from as we change to live the way God wants us to live? The writer of Exodus is laying the foundation for the longer, sadder story of Israel not learning that lesson, despite all that God did for them, and them not benefiting from his grace because they did not behave properly towards others. They failed in their ethics, their treatment of other people. It's because of this type of unfaithfulness to God and his ways, and their failure to be the people he called them to be, that they'll be destroyed. That's why they end up in Babylon, so that they could relearn the lesson. Anyway, let's get back to Exodus chapter 1. Pharaoh's plan of oppression and hard labour doesn't work, so he makes his next move. He turns to infanticide. Look at Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him, but if it's a daughter, she shall live. In the whole book of Exodus, Pharaoh is never named. We are never told which Pharaoh it is, and we can only guess. For all his fame and power, his life is insignificant to the writer. But here, these two women are named. These people, who are usually written out of big histories, get names. Their names mean beauty and splendour in Hebrew. I don't think this is actually what they were called. It's possible, but it's more likely that the writer is saying this is what we think of as beauty and splendour. It's behaving or living in the way that they do. These are the sorts of people we need to remember, because it's what goodness and godliness looks like. This type of life is the one that counts and should be remembered. They are the ones who leave a true and good legacy. Undoubtedly, there were more than two midwives for all Israel, but these two stand out as good characters to learn from. So we should put ourselves in the shoes of these characters. Consider their situation and their feelings and the options in front of them. Can you imagine them in their daily job? They're helping women give birth, which is both a frightening and exhilarating job to have, but only to be told, if you see the child coming out is a boy, you must kill it. What emotions would you have if you were told that? Maybe in your workplace you've been encouraged to compromise or to do something not quite right, but I doubt any of us have been asked to kill somebody in our workplace. How would these women respond? Well, of course, you'd think, well, they're just going to say no, but will they? What will be the consequences for them if they do say no? History tells us that many people will just comply, like they did in the Third Reich in Germany and in many countries today, where governments or social pressures get people to follow horrible orders. Good people can do bad things. And these women could have acted in that way. What would you do? Well, what will they do? The story goes on in verses 17 to 19. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." Here is the first mention of God in the story. And what does his presence do? His presence incites civil disobedience. They refuse to comply. They regard God and fear him more than Pharaoh. They stand up, but with wisdom. They show bravery and ingenuity in how they respond. They don't just let the boys live. In Hebrew, it means they actively help them to thrive. And they spin an ingenious tale to Pharaoh. Some people get worried about them telling a lie, but I think it's more of a joke on the Pharaoh. They say these Hebrews are a bit different to Egyptians. They're a bit like wild animals. They just drop their young and keep on running. Maybe that's playing to Pharaoh's prejudices, or maybe they believe he's just some dumb blokey bloke who'll believe any story because he knows nothing about women. Clearly, what the midwives say isn't the reality. If Hebrew women really did have their children like that, then they wouldn't need midwives at all. At least in this story, Pharaoh is so stupid that he believes this invented justification. And what's the outcome of their courage? Verse 20. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." And so state-sanctioned genocide begins. This is a key part of their life story. What will happen next? It didn't work to push them harder with hard labour. It didn't work to go through the midwives. Now he's raised up the whole populace to wipe out these people, to throw them all in the river and drown them. Will this plan succeed? Come back next week and we'll get to it in chapter 2 and you'll find out. But before we leave this story now, I want us to think of just a few things. I think the writer of Exodus uses the story of oppression in Egypt over and over, not to lay blame, not to induce sympathy, but to teach Israel its ethics as they live with God now. This is what you yourselves went through, the writer says. Therefore, you need to identify with those going through similar things. This is what you learn through this experience, to identify with those who suffer, to care for the oppressed and marginalised. Your role is to be my agents in caring for people. This is your history, this is your story, this is the legacy you are to leave. That's what you see in those two women. These are people we should emulate. They show courage and ingenuity in acting. They fear God, and at risk to their own lives and selves, they take a risk. They stand up to those in hostile power against them. They act to nurture life without knowing how things will end up. It's often complex to know what to do in this world, isn't it? It was complex for the midwives. What exactly do we do about our messy world? I think that's why we need each other. It's why we need to read this story together and think, well, what are the implications for us? How do I apply it in my world and my circle of influence? That's why we need to meet with each other, not just on a Sunday like today, but through the week and talk about this. So if you're not already part of one, I'd really encourage you to join a life group where we'll do this study together as we do life together. We need to help each other work out how to act. We need to share the struggles and the challenges along the way as we talk and pray together. So if you felt anything as we've engaged with this story so far, there's one last question I think that we must consider before we move on. It's the question, what about trauma? Imagine watching your baby son being thrown into a river. This is trauma. How do we ever recover from that if that's part of our life story? I think we need to be alert that many of us have been through trauma. Maybe not that one, but others. Some of us might have had something happen to us in the past that is buried deep within us and that maybe we don't realise is shaping us still. But it's one of those key events in our lifespan. Something might happen now and again and it just triggers us and we go back into that trauma all over again. We see the intergenerational trauma of oppressed peoples who are slaves today. We'll look at that in modern slavery in a few weeks' time. It's passed down to the next generation as traumatised parents raise their children and shape their environment and family life because they're still impacted by what happened to them. We see that in our own colonised people, our own Indigenous population, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people suffering from one generation to the next because of their trauma. They're shaped by things that happened before they were even born. We see it in people who are abused, whether it's sexual or physical, domestic violence. It impacts and carries on. We need to be alert about that in ourselves, to know our own story and to be compassionate to others who've been through such things. The question is, can we work as agents of healing? Can we be like those midwives? It's only possible, I think, when we've known our own story first, when we've begun to face our own past and understand ourselves. We must deal with our own issues, otherwise our help to others will be distorted and counterproductive. So today, as we finish Exodus 1, let's consider, what is our legacy? What song will be sung about us? I don't believe anyone will write a musical about me, but I do believe that God knows my story and he's happy to sing it with the saints in glory. That's the destiny he wants for all of us, the longing he wants fulfilled for us. Jesus says, come to me and I will give you life to the full. With me in your life, I want you to make a difference. And that's what we can have, but it's not done easily. It's a complicated story, as we'll see in Exodus, but it's what God is calling us to. What will your story be? When your days are done, what will be told? What will they say about you? Are you longing for something better now? And the invitation from God here is to act, to be like these two women. Let's not let this story just roll by. Let's do something about it. May God himself help us as we respond to him. This is his word to us today. I really hope to see you soon. Take care.
多謝牧師係藉着呢兩位收生婆嘅故事提醒我哋係冇睇環境嚇，我哋不順從人係應該係順從神，亦都係讓神喺我哋嘅生命中，喺我哋嘅心中，讓我哋嘅生命改變，係用我哋嘅生命去改變係別人嘅生命，成為別人嘅祝福嚇。跟住落嚟，我哋係奉獻。奉獻係信徒回應神愛嘅一個行動，亦都係崇拜嘅一個部分。請將預備好嘅係恭敬嘅奉獻。當司事將奉獻袋係傳俾你嘅時候，如果你係未預備嘅，你可以將奉獻袋傳俾隔離。我哋都係歡迎各位喺網上嚟到奉獻嘅。
所有奉於耶穌，是甘心樂意奉獻。我要思想愛主靠主，與主 直至永遠，全所有奉獻，全所有奉獻，獻於愛我尊貴救主，全所有奉獻，我將所有獻於耶穌，獻俾父奉主戰我，世界快樂甘願撇棄，求主今將我收留，全所有奉獻，全所有奉獻，獻於愛我尊貴救主，全所有奉獻。
今日係第二個主日，我哋有聖餐，請姚牧師為我哋主理。
係啊，今個月係今日係第二個主日，我哋喺語堂係我哋聖餐嘅主日。願意我哋去領呢個餅同埋呢個杯之前，我哋都有一段安靜嘅時候，預備好我哋嘅心去領受呢個餅同埋呢個杯，紀念主耶穌嘅死復活同埋再來。我哋有分係2分鐘嘅時候，我哋喺主面前有安靜嘅時候。主，最多謝你賜下你自己寶貴説話。你透過今日喺出埃及嘅一段經文啦，俾我哋去知道主你對我哋每一個人每一個生命都有我哋自己嘅命定，就好似以色列人一樣。主，求你叫我哋去把握我哋自己生命嗰個命定。又或者如果我哋真係仲未知道我哋自己生命嘅命定嘅時候，主願意我哋喺你面前去禱告，主求你叫我哋去睇見、去捉緊並且去掌握。多謝主你自己設立聖餐，以致到我哋能夠每個月我哋聚集一齊嘅時候，我哋一同去紀念，藉住餅藉住杯，係紀念主你嘅死、你嘅復活同埋你嘅再來。主，我哋多謝你。願意主你預備好我哋嘅心去領受呢個餅同埋呢個杯。多謝主你聽我哋嘅祈禱，奉我救主耶穌基督嘅名求。同樣喺哥林多前書都係用一段經文咧，去彼此提醒我哋去領呢個餅同埋呢個杯所需要有嘅態度，所需要有嗰個嘅認知。喺哥林多前書第11章23節開始咁樣講，佢話：我當日傳給你們的，原是從主領受的。 就是主耶穌被賣嘅那一夜，拿起餅來，祝謝了就擘開，說：這是我嘅身體，為你們捨的，你們應當如此行，為的是紀念我。飯後也照樣拿起杯來說：這杯是用我嘅血所立嘅新約，你們每逢喝嘅時候，要如此行，為的是紀念我。你們每逢吃這餅、喝這杯，是表明主嘅死，直等到他來。所以無論何人不按理吃主嘅餅、喝主嘅杯，就是干犯主嘅身、主嘅血了。人應當自己省察，然後吃這餅、喝這杯。因為人吃喝若不分辨是主嘅身體，就是吃喝自己嘅罪了。如果你相信主耶穌，我哋都歡迎你一齊去領呢個餅同埋呢個杯。請預備派餅杯嘅弟兄姊妹去預備。要攞餅嘅弟兄姊妹都攞咗咯，我哋一同站立，我哋將透明嗰張膠紙搣開去拎個餅出嚟。我手拎住呢個餅，代表主耶穌嘅身體喺十字架上為我哋去捨，為我哋嘅罪去捨，為你為我去捨。我哋一同領受，跟住我哋搣開銀色嗰張紙去。我手揸住呢個杯，載住個葡萄汁，代表主耶穌嘅血喺十字架上去流，洗淨我哋嘅罪。並且主耶穌話呢個係一個新約。佢話佢會再來，有一日我哋都可以同主耶穌一同坐席。呢個係主耶穌好寶貴嘅應許，我哋一同領受。主耶穌多謝你，你將你自己身體分享俾我哋，你將你自己身體喺十字架上擘開，所受嘅痛苦係比唔係我哋能夠想像嘅，但係主就係因為你嘅愛，以致到我哋能夠同你生命結連，並且你賜下寶貴應許，你話你會再來。主，我哋握住呢個應許，叫我哋有盼望，一路喺我哋生命當中。多謝主，你聽我哋嘅祈禱，奉我救主耶穌基督嘅名求，阿門。我哋一齊唱感恩歌。感謝主拯救我靈魂，感
謝主是我的泉源，感謝主白白賜給我這麼豐豐富富的救恩。
大家清楚。
我謹代表教會歡迎第一次係嚟到我哋當中參加崇拜嘅，唔知有冇新嘅來賓呢？我哋都係歡迎喺網上係參加崇拜嘅朋友，你可以用二維碼同我哋教會嘅牧者聯絡，我哋教會嘅牧者係好希望係認識你哋。跟住落嚟呢，我哋有家事嘅報告。我哋粵語堂嘅主日崇拜呢係已經回復實體啦，係好希望弟兄姊妹係翻嚟參加崇拜，但係翻嚟崇拜嘅時候呢，係請我哋大家係保持高度嘅防疫意識。喺嚟緊嘅6月19號嘅主日晏晝2點半將舉行 partnership meeting。呢一次嘅會議係審議新一年度嘅財政預算，同埋投票通過聘請兒童同埋青少年事工嘅傳道。因為呢個議案係需要有法定嘅人數出席同埋投票嘅，先能夠通過，所以係希望各位會員係預留時間出席商討事工。喺每個月嘅第4個禮拜日係本月26號崇拜之後係有聯誼嘅午餐，係請向各位組長報名。如果係未有參加小組嘅，可以向 Sylvia 報名。其他各項嘅事工呢，我哋係有你可以喺出邊攞呢個印咗嘅 bulletin， 或者係網上係教會係會傳俾各位嘅。同埋下半年度嘅司事人員呢係已經出咗㗎啦。如果係你覺得嗰個時間上有少少要轉嘅，你可以係轉完之後咧係話翻俾阿 Viola 聽嘅嚇。我哋一齊係誦讀本月嘅金句2次，係創世記12章2節。我必叫你成為大國，我必賜福給你，叫你的名為大。你也要叫別人得福。創世記12章2節。我必叫你成為大國，我必賜福給你，叫你的名為大。你也要叫別人得福。創世記12章2節。我哋請姚牧師為我哋祝福，跟住係唱主賜福你。
咁再一次提一提大家下個禮拜嗰個嘅 partnership meeting 咧，因為都要請同工投票嘅。咁大家都祈禱咗好耐，即係請兒童同埋青少年嘅同工啦。咁希望大家踴躍出席。如果唔係個 quorum 唔夠咧，就流會咧，咁就好麻煩啦，又要再 gather 一次咁樣。咁我都鼓勵弟兄姊妹預留下個禮拜下晝嘅時間一齊咧去參加呢個 partnership meeting， 呢個第一。第二咧就係咧頭先阿鐘生咧就喺呢度嘅男廁咧執到一個手提電話。咁咧如果你留咗個手提電話喺廁所咧，咁喺我度嘅，不過可能係英文堂啊，我唔知道嚇。OK， 好，我哋一同站立，領受從上帝而嚟嘅祝福。但願主耶穌基督，你係因為天父上帝你豐富嘅慈愛，聖靈嘅感動流動並且團契，常與我們嘅人同在，從今時直到永遠。阿門。
恩賜福氣，求賜信心不致動搖，無論晴或雨，時刻保守你，使你在今天嘗盡主恩義愛。神恩豐富供應，靈愛付出，心裏因你還見難避免，求主祝福你，使你在這刻嘗盡主恩大愛。
好，大家請坐。